Good evening. You're watching World News Tonight on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. Donald Trump says the United States will run Venezuela for now in the wake of a fiery overnight attack on the Russia ally and capture of President Nicolás Maduro. The US president telling the world tonight that he is reasserting American power in its home region as he temporarily takes over the country that holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. We begin our extensive coverage with President Trump speaking from Florida earlier today.
And it was an assault like people have not seen since World War II. We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
The arrest of President Maduro comes after months of tension between Washington and Caracas, with Donald Trump driving an intense pressure campaign to remove Maduro from power. And as explosions rung out across the Venezuelan capital, eyewitnesses captured the moment American forces arrived. TVP World's Ovidio Schneechea speaks exclusively to a Pole living in the embattled country.
America has removed Venezuelan dictator Nicolás Maduro from office.
Under our new national security strategy, American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again.
Explosions and the sound of low-flying aircraft rocked Venezuela before dawn. Eyewitness footage captured the moments when bombs rained down one after another. Scenes of chaos unfolded in the streets of the capital Caracas as Americans carried out the attack. President Nicolás Maduro was captured together with his wife and will stand trial in the U.S. facing charges of narco-terrorism.
The national security strategy of the Trump administration says this is the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century, which is the Western Hemisphere is America's. No one else should be able to influence it. No one else should be able to tell us what to do with it.
Venezuelans were seen celebrating in various places of the world. Poverty drove them out of their homeland. Now they see hope for a better future for their country.
We are free. We are all happy that the dictatorship has fallen and that we have a free country.
After so many years, after many struggles, after much work, today is the day.
The attack followed months of escalation when the US accused Maduro of drug trafficking and designated him a member of a foreign terrorist organization. The US carried out dozens of attacks on boats allegedly carrying drugs into the US. But tensions between Washington and Caracas go back decades.
Donald Trump, and indeed the defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, they just want to look like tough guys. You know, we can do this. We can enforce our will.
Recent Nobel Peace Prize winner and the face of Venezuelan opposition, Maria Corina Machado, has issued a statement.
Today we are prepared to enforce our mandate and take power. Let us remain vigilant, active and organized until democratic transition is realized. A transition that needs all of us.
For now, though, Donald Trump says the U.S. will stay in control and their military is ready for another attack if necessary.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
Venezuela sits on world's largest proven oil deposits. Donald Trump says he wants American companies to begin extracting Venezuelan oil to start making money for the country.
There are many Chinese companies involved, especially in the oil industry. So this is a quite attractive moment for Donald Trump just to say hello, but this is something that belongs to us.
Under Maduro, the country has struggled economically. Inflation in 2025 reached around 500%, and it's still much better than the figure for 2018, when it exceeded 1 million%. Poverty is widespread.
I hope the United States helps us rebuild, and I hope the European countries, the EU, will help us rebuild because the infrastructure's here. We just need people that know how to repair the framework and how to maneuver the framework. And we also have individuals here that are very, very smart. Their talents are underutilized. We have a lot of doctors, a lot of engineers.
7.7 million Venezuelans left their country since Maduro took power in 2013. According to the United Nations. That's about 1/5 of the country's population.
While many states recognize Venezuelan President Maduro as illegitimate, America's strikes have largely drawn caution from leaders in the West and opposition from the likes of Russia and China. As Kazimierz Wysiek reports, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk is among those weighing in, saying such events affect the entire world.
The US attack on Venezuela has been met with mixed reactions from world leaders. Since Maduro wasn't widely recognized as a legitimate ruler, US allies in Europe are mostly cautious, expressing neither support nor condemnation. Concern for the safety of the citizens has been the prevailing response.
In today's times, such massive events as today's attack by American forces affect the entire world. So we will react and prepare for this new situation.
I always say and believe we should all uphold international law. But I think at this stage, fast-moving situation, let's establish the facts and take it from there.
European leaders will also be hoping that President Trump doesn't shift too much focus away from Ukraine. Kyiv was quick to express its support for Donald Trump's operation.
Ukraine has consistently defended the right of nations to live freely, free of dictatorship, oppression, and human rights violations. The Maduro regime has violated all such principles in every respect.
But the Venezuelan regime has received statements of support from its closest partners, like Russia, China, Belarus, Iran, and the Lebanese terrorist group Hezbollah. Vladimir Putin in particular has been one of Maduro's closest allies.
The US committed an act of armed aggression against Venezuela, which gives rise to deep concern and warrants condemnation. The pretexts used to justify these actions are untenable.
This condemnation coming from a country waging war in Ukraine for the past 4 years for entirely fabricated reasons. The irony aside, analysts point to Russia's support for Maduro being mostly symbolic, despite promises of military aid.
At least they were not really able to provide such assistance like to save Maduro. I don't think that Russia is really in the position because they are actually struggling with this war against Ukraine. So they couldn't stop what President Donald Trump wanted to do in Venezuela.
Another major partner for the now dethroned dictator was China. The US attack came only hours after a Chinese delegation visited Maduro for talks on economic cooperation.
What just happened this morning is unprecedented, and it obviously will change the geopolitics in the Western Hemisphere with global impact. And China also, well, their position right now is obvious. They don't have that power they want to project in Latin America.
While the full consequences of the US military operation in Venezuela are yet to unfold, Donald Trump has kicked off the year 2026 with a clear message.
We're there now. We're ready to go again if we have to.
For TVP World, I'm Kazimierz Wysiek.
And for more on how the attack is being felt in Europe, let's go live to Brussels, where our correspondent Alex Cadier is standing by. Good evening, Alex. What have you heard in response to this American operation?
Well, good evening, Aaron. European leaders were always going to be between a rock and a hard place in responding to this kind of operation. On the one hand, they did not recognize Nicolás Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela. They had sanctioned him, sanctioned his regime, called for a fair, lawful, democratic transition of power and for the elections to be recognized under international law. But therein comes the problem, because for European leaders, perhaps the way the US went about this particular operation also puts into question international law. It turns the world from an international law-centered system to a sphere of influence system. That dissonance, that problem for European leaders has created a range of reactions ranging between measured, muddled, or meek. That dissonance creating a statement like this one from the EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas.
The EU has repeatedly stated that Mr. Maduro lacks legitimacy and has defended a peaceful transition. Under all circumstances, the principles of international law and the UN Charter must be respected. We call for restraint.
So the EU's top diplomat calling for your restraint there, Aaron. We've heard from the German Chancellor actually in the last 20 minutes or so, saying the legal classification of the US deployment is complex. We will take our time with that. The benchmark remains international law. Now, if you want to find slightly stronger condemnation of this action by the United States, turn to France. We heard this from the French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot.
The military operation that led to the capture of Nicolás Maduro violates the principle of non-resort to force that underpins international law. France recalls that no lasting political solution can be imposed from the outside and that sovereign peoples alone decide their future.
And we've heard further condemnation from France from a political ally of Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, saying the fundamental reason to oppose this action is that sovereignty of states is never negotiable. To renounce it would be to accept our own enslavement tomorrow, thus a moral peril. Of course, because if the United States can do this and not look at international law, why can't others do the same in Europe and in the Far East?
Alex Cadier, our correspondent in Brussels, thank you. And we'll break all of this down in an exclusive interview with Kurt Volker, former US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations and US Ambassador to NATO, later on World News Tonight. In other news, Kyiv has played host to high-level talks over the future of Ukraine, with national security advisers arriving from across Europe to hash out an end to Russia's war. It comes as President Donald Trump says too many people are dying at the hands of the Kremlin and that he's, quote, not thrilled with Vladimir Putin. For more, I'm joined now by our correspondent, Oz Cadier in Kyiv. Good evening to you, Oz. So what do we know about today's security talks?
Well, a very large delegation of Ukraine's partners, the national security advisors of those countries, visited Kyiv for talks with the Ukrainian government. They included Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Spain, all the Baltic states, Poland, Finland, Sweden, Canada, Norway, and the Netherlands. So a very large delegation heading to Ukraine. Now, President Zelensky's new chief of staff, Kirill Budanov, called the talks productive, but very little in the way of material facts coming out of those talks of any substance about what we're going to see in terms of policy. The Ukrainians are pleased that there is still a show of support from European nations, from Canada and the United Kingdom, showing that they maintain that level of support for Ukraine while it enters this critical period of negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. Now, TVP World spoke exclusively to the Undersecretary of State for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Robert Kupiecki. Here is what he had to say.
We spent a very productive day today in Kiev. For over 8 hours, we've been talking with the leadership of Ukraine on the prospect of peace in this country, and obviously on the state of preparation to the signature of the documents, providing for the basic conditions of peace. We compared notes, and we delivered statements on the part of the coalition of the willings, offering comments, offering our views, and offering our amendments to the draft documents that were presented to us.
So while talk of an agreement between Russia and Ukraine is still premature, Ukraine's partners, certainly those that have identified themselves as part of the coalition of the willing, still showing their support for Kyiv, something that will be warmly welcomed by Zelensky's administration here. Now, this comes amidst the backdrop of further attacks on Ukraine by Russia. 6 people dead, 42 injured in Russian attacks across Ukraine over the last 24 hours. A particularly bad one in Kharkiv last night, killing 2 people, including a 3-year-old child, and leaving 31 others injured. So, look, Ukraine is in a very, very difficult position. It's in a difficult position militarily. It's in a difficult position politically. So these shows of support, these discussions, whether they be technical or diplomatic in nature, are going to be important for Ukraine, particularly when there is a news agenda elsewhere in the world that is distracting people from attention on the situation here, particularly when Ukraine is so reliant on that support from the United States to continue. So look, the talks continue here in Ukraine. There'll be further talks expected in the coming weeks. But for now, as far as the Ukrainians go, these technical level discussions from the coalition of the willing partners were considered productive by Kyiv, Aaron.
Cadier, our correspondent in Kyiv. Thank you. Staying in Ukraine, where President Volodymyr Zelensky is overseeing a major reshuffle of his war cabinet, more than a month after revelations of a kickback scheme in the country's energy sector. That corruption scandal ultimately led to the resignation of Zelensky's top aide, Andriy Yermak, and 2 ministers, who are now being replaced with fresh faces. Anastasia Yanchenko reports.
Just over a month after a major corruption row rocked Ukrainian politics, the President Zelensky has launched an internal reset with a series of government reshuffles. On Saturday, former Prime Minister and now also former Defense Minister Denis Shmyhal was appointed to lead the country's energy ministry. President Volodymyr Zelensky called his candidacy perfect for a sector that remains a primary target of Russian attacks and has yet to fully recover from a recent corruption scandal.
I am grateful for his systematic work in the Ministry of Defense and for the processes stepped up to ensure the protection of our state. This kind of systematic approach is exactly what Ukraine's energy sector needs right now.
Shmyhal's leadership post at the Defense Ministry will now be filled by Mikhailo Fedorov. At 34 years old, the youngest minister in Ukraine's history. He first joined the government as a Minister of Digital Transformation at the age of 28. The decision comes as President Volodymyr Zelensky seeks to change the working format of the ministry.
We must implement defense sector changes that will be of help. Mikhailo Fedorov will be able to implement all of this and add technological efficiency.
Fedorov is one of the very few officials who have been with Zelensky since the start of his political career in 2019, and the only minister to survive all government reshuffles so far. He implemented the president's state within a smartphone vision, launching the DIA app in 2020 to bring government services like ID cards, driving licenses, and even marriage or divorce registration directly to people's phones. During Russia's full-scale invasion, he also oversaw drone procurement and coordinated with US tech billionaire Elon Musk to secure Starlink terminals, which quickly became crucial to Ukraine's war effort.
He is one of the ministers in the current cabinet with the strongest reputation. People tend to associate him more with achievements and accomplishments rather than failures and problems.
Fedorov was also considered as a possible replacement for Yermak as a head of the presidential office, but the position ultimately went to Kirill Budanov, head of Ukraine's military intelligence agency. However, experts say Zelensky's decision to appoint Fedorov as defense minister could prove risky.
During a war, can we really afford for ministers to spend months just getting up to speed and finding their footing? I don't think we can.
At least 4 major cabinet changes have already taken place in the first 3 days of 2026, with more expected. One of those shifts could possibly happen in Ukraine's counterintelligence agency, the SBU, where current head Vasyl Maluk may be replaced. Under Maluk, the agency carried out high-profile operations inside Russia, including the 2025 Spiderweb mission, where Ukrainian drones struck Russian strategic bombers on protected airfields, causing an estimated $7 billion in damage to Russia's military aviation.
I still don't see any solid reason to replace the head of the SBU. What I do see is that Zelensky is clearly going all in on consolidation under the current circumstances, treating it as essentially his final, decisive battle.
These changes are part of a major political reshuffle announced by President Zelensky last September, but they come at a critical moment for Ukraine as diplomatic efforts ramp up, and according to Zelensky, the peace deal draft is 90% complete. Anastasia Yanchenko, TVP World.
And joining me now for an exclusive interview is Kurt Volker, former US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations and US Ambassador to NATO. Good evening to you, Mr. Ambassador.
Good evening. Great to be with you.
So on a day of such dramatic developments, Washington attacking Venezuela, capturing its leader, bringing him back to America, and Donald Trump saying, well, look, I'm going to run the country, many watching tonight will be asking 2 things. What does that look like? And what does all of this mean for the world at large?
Yeah, well, the first part is a really interesting question because the only way the U.S. could effectively run the country is if we're going to be using the Venezuelan police, the state administration, the military, and so forth that are already there. And so what seems to be happening is the U.S. is going to be providing some kind of umbrella over the vice president of Venezuela who will take charge and run things until a different transition can be arranged.
I guess the question is, Nicolás Maduro is widely regarded as having been illegitimate, but Mr. Ambassador, given your extensive experience in various White House administrations, I'm interested, do you believe that the President of the United States has crossed a red line?
It's a really tough question, and I think it'll really depend on how things play out. Because think about what this means now. He just gave a warning to Iran, to the mullahs, about cracking down violently on protesters in Iran. They will now take that warning more seriously, given what just happened in Venezuela. Second, when it comes to the border, the U.S. southern border, drug trafficking, states taking advantage, basically, of the openness of the U.S., they're going to be thinking twice about that as well. I think China will have been struck by the use of military force. Trump, of course, has been seen as an isolationist at times, but this is anything but isolationist. This is very aggressive. So I think it's going to cause a lot of countries to recalculate.
Why do we see America so brazen in Venezuela, making these threats as well to Iran, but for example, when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, seemingly more hesitant, tiptoeing around the issue?
Yeah. Well, I think with Venezuela, there are several things. One of them, it is a weaker country. It doesn't have nuclear weapons. It's also in the hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere, which Trump has singled out as something of special concern for the United States. And it was a source of drug trafficking and other nefarious activities coming to the U.S., as well as instability in South America and Central America. So there are a lot of things that are of direct U.S. interest there. And in contrast, Trump has not defined Ukraine's democracy, Ukraine's sovereignty, Ukraine's success as a vital U.S. interest the way that other U.S. administrations have done. Even so, I think that Vladimir Putin will have to take note of Trump's willingness to use force and the effectiveness of that force when he was willing to do so. And what I think we see in Ukraine right now, Putin has sided with Venezuela. He has lied to Trump several times, including most recently about this Ukrainian drone strike. And I think Trump is trying to signal to Putin it is time for him to end the war, or things will get worse for Putin now too.
You mentioned the Western Hemisphere. Just over a month ago, the White House released that national security strategy, the one that talked about Europe facing civilizational erasure, but of course also that 19th century Monroe Doctrine. Tonight, Donald Trump saying that doctrine has been superseded. They even joked about a Don Roe Doctrine. Are we seeing a Washington unashamedly putting its power above all else, and I guess really practically building back these walls and spheres of influence?
I'd say under President Trump, yes, that is very much what he's doing. He is willing to use force, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, and show that a sphere of influence, as you say. I'm not sure that he recognizes other countries having spheres of influence, however. I don't think there's a recognition of China having a sphere of influence in East Asia. And I think the jury is still out with Putin. I think that he has strengthened NATO. He has urged peace in Ukraine and urged a ceasefire. So we have to see how he continues with Putin going forward, knowing that Putin has played him and lied to him time and again.
What about China in all of this? You mentioned China. Venezuela, of course, has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. China is Venezuela's biggest customer for oil exports. Mr. Maduro also pictured meeting with Chinese officials just this week. Is President Trump trying to send a message here to Beijing to tell Xi Jinping, look, back off the turf of the North and South American continents?
I think there is a message in that, and also a message to China that we are in a stronger position than they think. think China has underestimated the U.S., especially over the past few administrations where we have not acted assertively. I think this is a message to China. We have both the capability and the will to play a very strong role. And that should cause China both to back off the Western Hemisphere, but also to tread carefully in East Asia.
Renowned historian Peter Frankopan wrote today that if Trump can do this to Maduro, why not Putin to Zelensky? On the question of international law, how dangerous a precedent could this set of global superpowers being ready and willing to take international law into their own hands?
Yeah. Right. Well, in terms of international law, it is very troubling because whereas the United States has framed this as a domestic law enforcement issue, Maduro was indicted on drug charges and arrested officially under DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, for trafficking drugs into the United States. So that's the legal basis, which is a domestic legal basis rather than an international one. But the comparison is exactly right. Putin has indeed tried to assassinate Zelensky several times, has been unable to do so, and that's one of the main differences is Russia has much weaker capabilities. But in terms of the legal argumentation, other countries will certainly make the legal argument that they have a similar right to the United States based on their own domestic law to say that they're going to go and topple another leader.
In French Foreign Minister Barrot, he says the military operation to capture Maduro is, quote, violating the principle of non-resort to force that underpins international law. Can we say, with the facts in front of us tonight, that Donald Trump has broken international law?
I think that we have different interpretations there. So just as you said, the French Prime Minister would say that's their interpretation. But again, the U.S. interpretation is going to be very different from that Maduro had broken international and U.S. domestic law, and he was arrested under U.S. domestic law. That'll be the interpretation that they make. So I don't think it's quite as black and white as that.
Now, on the flip side, is there an argument, Mr. Ambassador, to be made that strong men like Maduro, like Iran's supreme leader, like Vladimir Putin, only understand the language of force, and that Donald Trump is in his right to use violence to compel change?
Yeah, well, again, we're going to have different views about whether he's within his rights or not. But in terms of understanding the way these strong men think and behave and how to actually influence them, Donald Trump is right that force is the way that they respond to things. And as you pointed out, sadly, we have not been willing to exert more pressure and show more force toward Vladimir Putin because he thinks the same way as these other strongmen.
The Kremlin has already condemned these American strikes. Does what's happening in Venezuela, and our correspondent in Kyiv earlier pointed this out, risk shifting attention away from Ukraine? Or could it serve as a reminder, I guess, to the White House that Russia has been, in some ways, Maduro's enabler?
Yeah, I think the latter, actually. I think what I've been struck by in some of the news coverage and even some of the things that President Trump has said today, it is a recognition that Putin has been on the side of Maduro. He even made a comparison to the ineffectiveness of Russia's military forces. So I think he is seeing Russia today, at least, through the light of their affiliation with Maduro.
Now, we're running out of time, but some will say a country that pushes allies and friends away, that acts with force when it so desires, is a bully. Is America acting like a bully?
Well, as you're saying, some people will say that, and they'll say we are just letting might drive. You know, we have the capability. We'll just do whatever we want. That might makes right. Some people will make that argument. It'll be interesting, as I said, to see how this shakes out over a few days and weeks, because, you know, in some ways, while this is troubling from an international legal point of view, if it actually does make Venezuela better, makes the world better, pushes back some of these dictators who have been taking advantage of a liberal world order, well, that might be a salutary effect.
Mr. Kurt Volker, former US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations and former US Ambassador to NATO. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And that's all for World News Tonight. Do stay with us here on TVP World for the very latest. I'm Aaron Darman. Good night.